So as you can see, there's appendages to the body sharing this piece with you. And I want to say a few words about the piece, but before I do that, I actually just want to invite you into a little bit of a practice that I use to arrive at all ceremonies. And I feel like this is a ceremony, and I'll say more about that in a moment. So just invite you all to just take a couple of breaths. Maybe if you want to just stretch into any of those places, invite a little circulation. Maybe soften your gaze a little bit or close your eyes if that's more comfortable. Consider softening your jaw and your belly, maybe softening the soles of your feet on the ground. Let your breath deepen, and as you do, use your inhales just to entrust yourself to the intelligence and support of your own skin. Also use your exhales to entrust the weight of everything contained within your skin to the unconditional support of the earth below you. Maybe imagining dropping roots that anchor you in that unconditional support. Letting those roots anchor you as you also entrust yourself to the length of your body. I like to think of our length as our natural design to rise up, to grow tall, to take a stand, so to speak, on behalf of the things that we love. So rest in that aspect of your design. If it feels comfortable, feel free to broaden your gaze, maybe open your eyes. Take a few breaths to entrust yourself into the depth of your body, really resting in all of the experience and all of the ancestry that is at your back. And entrusting yourself to the responsibility and the opportunity to shape the future, to impact future generations. Feel the space in between. The right relationship to past and future is to be as present as possible in the present. And take a few breaths and trust yourself to your width. I like to think of this as our design to take up space, to impact and be impacted by all of life, and particularly by those that stand by us in the present, allies and adversaries alike. And lastly, take a few breaths and trusting those dimensions to each other. See if you can find a sweet spot where they all become more resilient, more at ease, and more expressed because of the intersection of their differences. Maybe entrust yourself to the intersection of our differences with those in the room, those impacting us that are not in the room. And I'm going to share a sensation, and I invite you to check in with your body and see if you can just find one sensation in your body that's asking to be known. I'm going to share one, and a few of us are going to speak them. And as we share them, I invite you to let yourself be impacted by what we share. So I'll start by saying, I feel a heaviness. Not a big heaviness, but a solidity and a grounding in the front lower part of my abdomen.
I feel a wide coolness in my chest.
So thank you all. I always like to start that way because it makes me arrive, and then I can be present with you. So I just want to say a few things about this piece before we start. I really want to thank you, Evan, and the Better Ancestor series for this opportunity. It's even the phrasing of that, Better Ancestors, just feels like a real opportunity and an invitation. And the piece that we're going to share feels very much aligned with that speaking. And I think the words that Joyce read also felt very much aligned. And I trust that the pieces that are coming after are very much aligned with what we're meant to hear this evening and how we're supposed to be impacted. Yeah, great. Got it. So this is a piece from a book that I'm working on, and the name of the book is The Story of We, Authorizing the Myths That Saved Our Lives. And it also feels like it's an excerpt from my life and from a very long ceremonial rites of passage, death, birth cycle. And there's a very real one at play in my life right now, so it feels very perfect. So I invited some friends and some family to be in this, and I invite you to be in this with us. So this is not a performance. I was excited by the word performance because it felt better than a reading, and then I realized that I'm anti-white supremacy and performativity, so then that didn't feel right. So this feels like an embodiment and a ceremony, and I'd like to just invite you all to be in that with us. And is there anything else I want to say there? And the only last thing to say is the content of this piece touches into some moments from my life that are related to sexual trauma. So for those who have a similar history with that, take care and do what you need to be resourced. Again? Children, family, kin, gather round. I have a story to tell. This is the story, or one version of the story, of my coming of age, of my coming into the age of a burgeoning elder, a better ancestor, and a storyteller. The story is definitely not his story. One might think of it as my story, though it has been shaped by far too many life forms and belief systems for me to stake such a claim. Besides, it would bring my heart the utmost joy if you would relate to it, or at least to some aspects of it, as your story. As such, and with the aspiration of ever weaving ourselves into a more intimate whole, I humbly call it our story. Before we begin, it feels important to disclose that I don't believe that this story is the truth, nor are any of the other stories that we hear or tell, including those reported in the news or in scientific or academic journals. That's not to say that this story or those stories are lies. It's simply my way of saying that I don't believe that a solitary or definitive truth exists. Christianity's dominance of the Western world teaches us to believe that life solely expresses itself in dichotomies of right or wrong, good or bad, truth or fiction. This practice of severing the world into twos is in and of itself a story, and in my humble opinion, a deeply harmful one. The dominance of this two-dimensional either-or story literally kills off the possibility of a yes and. I believe many of us are deeply yearning for a dominant culture of yes and possibilities, one that invites us into a contemplative engagement with truth and with each other, similar to that which emerges from questions like, when a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it? Does it make a sound? I trust that all schools of science, news, academics, and even religion would agree that all the stories we think of as the truth simply began as something someone believed. They were shared because the believer felt the story was important for others to consider. Others then believed, validated, and retold these stories because it struck a resonant chord of safety, inspiration, belonging, or power. So, while I don't believe anything I'm sharing here is the truth, I know it is a myth that inspires my own feelings of safety, belonging, and power. It does so by remembering my dignity to the dignity of all of life. It is also the myth through which I reclaim the authority to author my own narrative. This myth began back in the fall of 2010 when I found myself at the gates of San Quentin prison on a stormy Thursday morning.
As I exited the high speeds of the San Rafael Richmond Bridge and entered the quiet, unincorporated village of San Quentin, population of 100, I remember thinking this sleepy coastal village with the bay lapping at its shore seemed like an idyllic refuge from the urban realities of the Ohlone Bay Area. Stepping out of my car into the prison's parking lot, wind and rain slapped me from every direction. Nature's raw expression sobered me into remembrance that this seemingly innocent town is home to California's oldest prison, the state's only death row for male inmates, and the largest death row in the United States. The weather felt like an appropriate initiation to this land and for the conversations awaiting me on the other side of the prison gates. But before I describe what I found through those gates, I want to go back even further to 2007, when I found myself in the midst of the worst health crisis of my life.
I hadn't slept soundly for months. I was riddled with anxiety. The experience of engaging with the world felt like walking through a house of flames. I overreacted to everything. My social skills were atrocious. I was experiencing an emotional breakdown, and there was no obvious reason why. When I went to the doctor, I was diagnosed with severe anemia, adrenal depletion and depression, hyperthyroidism, and the equivalent of a 6-month pregnancy worth of tumors in my uterus. The doctors recommended we medicate and operate, though they couldn't explain the source of my dis-ease, nor provide any reasonable expectation that the treatments prescribed would prevent the symptoms from coming back. The lack of explanation or cure left me terrified, and seriously contemplating if escaping my life for good was the most dignified path forward. Thankfully, suicidal ideation turned out to be a non-starter, since I'm not into violence, pain, or prescription medication. Instead, it invited me to get more curious about the sources of my suffering. I started wondering, if I can't find a way out of my body, perhaps I should figure out how to get more fully into it, and into relationship with the events and circumstances I'm most afraid of. At that time, I was most afraid of the tumors.
I started a daily meditation practice of lovingly placing my hands on the bulbous growths in my belly and asking them, "What are you here to teach me?" With time, they remembered me to the fact that I had been raped multiple times as a teenager by people I knew and trusted, and had processed the resulting pregnancies like I was getting my car repaired. This got me thinking about a lot of things, including something a therapist once said: betrayal is often one of the most powerful gateways to enlightenment. When she first shared this idea with me, I thought I was being directed to look at the places in my life where I had been betrayed by others. This tumor guidance made me realize that those events were actually gateways for me to recognize the places where I had betrayed myself. One of the most significant ways I had betrayed myself was in not claiming my story.
For the better part of the last 20 years, I walked around like being raped was normal, expected, no big deal. I was simultaneously terrified to tell anyone, fearing people would blame me, say I deserved it, call me a slut, not believe me. As I stood at the precipice between life and death, I realized my lifeline was dependent on my ability to look people in the eye and say with dignity, I was raped. I was forced to have sex against my will. It was not my choice. It was not my fault. I did not deserve it. Soon after I began sharing my story with friends and colleagues, I was invited to participate in the San Quentin Prison Victim Offender Education Group, a restorative justice initiative where violent crime survivors share their stories with the lifers in the program. This offered both groups the opportunity to serve as surrogates to the healing and rehabilitation of the other. A few weeks after receiving this invitation, I found myself at the gates of San Quentin on that rainy Thursday morning.
Prior to arrival, I made a promise to myself to not give these men the power to validate or invalidate my story. Then, as I walked through multiple security gates, each reverberating buzzer and slam moistened my armpits and hands, slicking my grip on this commitment. I was escorted into the garden chapel, where gently hued light shone through panels of stained glass. 8 inmates shifted wooden pews and unstacked chairs, placing them in a meticulous circle. The sanctity of the space, as well as the humble pride of these men, welcoming a special guest into their home, deepened my breath. Then other men began filing into the room, and the reality of sharing the most difficult experiences of my life with a group of 40 men serving life sentences kicked in. My breath halted. I wanted to cry. I wanted to leave. Yet I felt far too entangled by the commitment to do either.
As the facilitator rang the initiatory bell, the intrinsic practice of gathering in circle began working its magic. After some context and ground rules were established, we were each invited to check in with the group by responding to the question, how are you doing physically, emotionally, and spiritually? One by one, each man vulnerably shared, exposing heroic efforts to find peace and divine order within their circumstances. I felt my belly soften and my breath deepen. My fear and disorientation began to dissipate. Once the check-ins were complete, I began to share my story. Come here. Psst. Thank you. And I just want to name the beings up here with me. This is Damon Francis, who I think of as my brother. This is Bronte Velez, who is my sister. I don't even know what you are. You're just family on so many levels. This is Caro Acuna on sounds, and the laughter was Isel Ayudeli Taylor. Yeah.